All right, so let's go ahead and get started. As you can see, and as all of you registered for, we're going to be talking about identity management today. And I just have a couple notes to say before I turn it over to our speaker. So a few comments. We'll do a Q&A session at the end. So the format will be about 30 minutes of presentation, about 15 minutes, give or take, of Q&A. And you all should be able to answer, or to ask questions, rather, via the GoToWebinar control panel here. There's a little question section where you can type them in. I'll be keeping an eye on those, collecting them, and facilitating the Q&A at the end. And I also wanted to mention, so everybody knows, I know a lot of you have registered for more than one session. Some of you might have been at an earlier session just a couple hours ago, but we do have 4 more great sessions in our 365 Ninja Live webinar series after this one. You can still sign up at live.365ninja.com. And I will be sending out links to the recordings. So even if you can't attend, go ahead and register for those sessions that you're interested in, because you'll have the option to view them afterwards. So I think that's my only kind of housekeeping notes here. So let's go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Green as our speaker. He is a solutions architect with Netrix on their online productivity and collaboration team. And he has a lot of great experience. He has experience on every version of Exchange from 03 to 13. He also has migration experience from IBM GroupWise, Lotus Domino, Lotus Notes, third-party systems into Exchange 2007, and including Exchange Online. So a lot of great experience to share in this area. And I will turn it over to him. So you can take it away, Matt.
Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here today. Thank you everyone on the call for joining as well. I appreciate your time. And my goal today is to talk about identity management with Office 365, discussing the differences between Azure Active Directory Sync and Active Directory Federation Services, otherwise known as ADFS. While there are other ways to manage identities for Office 365, these are the predominant 2 players in the space in my experience, and so those will be the 2 that I'm focused on today. So when we talk about Office 365 or the cloud, it's important to remember that there's more to it than just Office 365. The cloud is a very generic term now, referencing really anything out on the internet, anything that has infrastructure or services made available to you that is not homed within your house or your organization's data center or server room. And so there's a lot of logins to pay attention to. And so Microsoft has focused on identity and access management as a way to help accomplish a number of objectives for organizations. They look at what they call the Azure Active Directory as a way to leverage existing investment in a local Active Directory, a way to potentially provide single sign-on to any cloud or on-premises web application. So as we remember that previous slide, looking at alternative technologies, alternative services, Microsoft Azure Active Directory can also provide a portal into those applications as well. Multi-factor authentication, considering security around your identity and access management. Integration with multiple platforms and devices. We're in an age where we're not tied to a single computer or even a single mobile device. There are tablets. Many people have multiple smartphones, multiple laptops between the house and the office. And also looking at things like self-service password resets, group management, being in a position to enable the end user to handle things that were previously potentially handled by a help desk or an alternate resource, really putting the end user in command of managing their own identity where it makes sense. And so Microsoft has moved forward with this strategy of using identity as the control plane. And by control plane, we mean we're looking at our on-premise organization, our on-premises organization, existing applications, your Windows Server Active Directory, other directories that may be in place, such as GroupWise, Lotus, Domino, things of that nature. Looking at our cloud investment, Azure, public cloud, Office 365, applications that are out there, potentially competing cloud solutions from a Microsoft perspective as well. And putting Azure Active Directory in between those two solutions, those two environments, as a way to provide a simple connection, a way to provide a single sign-on so that users are not constantly having to use different usernames and passwords, and a way to provide that self-service capability. So users can go to their mobile device, to their tablet, to their laptop, and they can log into all of these investments, all of these productivity solutions simply. And then on top of all of that, we always want to incorporate auditing, security, operational monitoring, and reporting. It is not enough to only supply the identity or only supply the access. Most organizations are also focused on maintaining some security and some information and reporting around those logins. So as a comprehensive solution here, the Azure Active Directory is looking to provide a cloud directory for identity management, application provisioning, and access management. This is much more than logging into Office 365. This is an identity solution that can give you access to everything that you've published internally, everything that you want to make available externally. And so the question that is presented to organizations is, how do we populate this Azure Active Directory? How do we get our accounts out in the cloud in a way that is the least amount of impact to the end users and the most amount of usability? How do we make it a seamless transition? Microsoft has made this hybrid identity idea very simple. 6 clicks to the cloud is what they like to say. The current tool, after a series of evolutions, renditions, programmatic advances to directory synchronization, is what they call Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect incorporates previous solutions. You may have heard of just DIRSync or directory synchronization. Azure AD Sync has been out there, Forefront Identity Manager plus an Azure AD Connector. Those are all different solutions that have been out in the past. Azure AD Connect now replaces all of those. Azure AD Sync is a piece of Azure AD Connect. Additionally, you may want to look at the other technology that we referenced at the beginning, which is Active Directory Federation Services. That is used for more complex enterprise deployments. There are use cases involved where you may want to look at tighter AD integration, security policies, conditional access, or smart card authentication. So with all of this in mind, let's go through a few core identity scenarios and really try and firm up the foundation of what I've been discussing here. Keep it simple. We've got Bob. Bob's looking to log into Office 365. How does Bob do that? Bob has our Windows Azure Active Directory account. There are a number of protocols that are supported here. There's an amount of information that is accessible, again, from a reporting, auditing standpoint, as well as potentially analytics if you're looking to take your user information that far. That's going to provide you the authentication into Office 365. So these are two different Microsoft Cloud solutions in what would be looked at as, you know, the quote-unquote Microsoft Cloud. So how do we get Bob's account into Windows Azure? Most simply, sorry, let me back up a minute. The authentication allows Bob to get access to what he's licensed for, whether that be Office 365, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive, Skype for Business, the administration portal, or potentially Office Activation Services for things like Office Pro Plus subscriptions. Okay, moving forward, how do we get Bob in there? Most simply, we could create a spreadsheet and do a simple CSV import. Every user gets populated into Azure Active Directory. Every user would then have to be edited within Windows Azure Active Directory, or a spreadsheet would need to be maintained and routinely imported. For small organizations, or for organizations that are just starting out, a greenfield deployment where they intend to use Azure Active Directory as the source for all identities moving forward, this may be a sufficient solution, but it's not very common. Typically what we see is that Bob wants to access Office 365, but Bob already has a local Active Directory where he has an account. And so we look at directory synchronization and password synchronization. Using Azure AD Connect and Azure AD Sync as part of Azure AD Connect, we can synchronize local accounts into Azure Active Directory. This provides two benefits. Firstly, anytime we do the editing of users, adding users, removing users, changing users' information, we only have to do it in one location. Our local Active Directory is the source for all of our account information, which is then synchronized out into Azure Active Directory, which then provides us that authentication mechanism. Additionally, with password sync, we can have what's called same sign-on. So whether the user is logging in with their username and password in local Active Directory, or they're using their username and password in Windows Azure Active Directory, technically two separate accounts, but because of the password synchronization, the end user does not need to remember a different username and password. Because it's a synchronization, if the password is changed on premises, that password hash is synchronized out to Azure Active Directory, which then allows the change to take place on both sides. Going into the complex scenario, the federated identity, where ADFS would be incorporated, we still have Azure AD Sync in play. We're still synchronizing from our local Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is then going to make the authentication request to Office 365. But Office 365 is going to let Azure know that this is a federated identity. And when that happens, Azure Active Directory will actually go back to your on-premises organization, to your ADFS infrastructure, to look for a token. And that token is provided based upon your local username and password, or Kerberos authentication, smart card authentication, whatever way we choose to move forward with that implementation. There's a trust in place, so Azure Active Directory is saying, I'm not going to authenticate on behalf of this user. ADFS is going to provide a token to Office 365, and I trust that that token is appropriate to give the user the authorization to whatever they're licensed for. This federated identity allows us a greater degree of control over the login experience from a security and logistics perspective. So let's do a deep dive into ADFS. There's obviously some more complexity involved there, so let's talk through it. From a high-level architecture standpoint, Azure AD Sync is pretty simple. We've got a directory store. There are users in there. Those users get synchronized out. But when we look at Active Directory Federation services, there's a trust established in an authentication platform that is directed to trust the token that comes from ADFS to get the user into Office 365. For Office 365, Microsoft is using the Microsoft Federation Gateway. Typically, if you go to Outlook.com, if you go to Office 365, if you go to Live.com, if you go to Hotmail, any of those legacy systems, the Microsoft Federation Gateway is providing that authentication platform. In a federated identity scenario, Microsoft Federation Gateway is deferring that authentication out to ADFS and allowing ADFS to provide the token that gives them access into Office 365. So we've got cloud identity plus directory synchronization, or we have single sign-on and directory synchronization. So again, because we are logging in internally, we have authentication capabilities in place that give us a greater degree of controlling the end user experience. What does that mean? It means if I am getting my token to authenticate to Office 365 through my local Active Directory, I can pass through credentials from a domain joined machine to automatically log me in. So with Azure AD Sync, moving an identity out to the cloud with password synchronization, we get same sign-on. Here's my username, here's my password locally, I log in, I go out to the cloud, I provide a username and a password that is the same to the end user, and it logs me in. In an ADFS scenario, I could take a domain joined machine, log into the domain joined machine, go out to Office 365, and the machine can pass my credentials to the ADFS server, which then would automatically give me access. So I'm not even providing a password or a username at that point. So I'm getting a true single sign-on experience. I logged into my machine, that's the only place I need to log in. If we take that one step further and look at publishing other applications within Windows to Azure using the Azure Active Directory accounts, I could then provide potentially a single sign-on experience not only to Office 365, but any other application I chose to publish out there. Common examples are things like Salesforce. Box is one that we've seen, Workday, but there is a gallery out there of literally thousands of applications that could be published, and then you can use this single sign-on approach to provide authentication into all of those applications. A little bit deeper dive here. Protocols used by ADFS. There are web services protocols, SAML tokens, SAML 2.0, SAML 1.1. So there's a number of supported mechanisms here that you can tie into ADFS with. Additionally, there are strong authentication solutions. So Office 365 and Azure Active Directory have their own multi-factor authentication solution that's available. You can use the web application proxy, which is a front end to ADFS, and provide secondary authentication solutions such as a NetScaler or an RSA token kind of solution and tie those in. You cannot do that only using Azure AD Sync. But once you bring your authentication source internally, you can layer on top of that to provide additional levels of control. And then one big thing to consider is that rich client access may be dependent on the configuration. Not every piece of security or every login method is supported by every application, specifically when we look at things like ActiveSync or different versions of Office. So certainly important to be aware of. When I talk about different versions of Office, when I talk about ActiveSync, we're referring to the client endpoints. A client endpoint is not a PC or a tablet or a mobile device. Client endpoint is the actual application we're using to log in. There are 3 different ways that a user can log in. We have active federation. This would apply to rich clients supporting ADFS, such as Office 2013. Clients negotiate directly with that on-premises ADFS server. So in this scenario, I try to log into Office 365. It refers me back to ADFS. And then from my client endpoint, I go directly to the ADFS server, whether internally or externally, and I negotiate the authentication there. Basic authentication, or what we would call an active profile, applies to clients authenticating with basic authentication. So think ActiveSync, Outlook Anywhere with Outlook 2007-2010, IMAP POP, some SMTP relay services such as printer scanners, and Exchange Web Services. This differs slightly because in the example of Exchange Online, a user will try to authenticate to Office 365. And rather than the user being referred back to ADFS, Exchange Online will actually go to ADFS with the username and password that was passed to it through basic authentication and try to authenticate on behalf of that user. This is a very important factor to consider because if you're looking at things like restricting the ability to log into Office 365 by IP range, you now are lessening your ability to get that done because Exchange Online is attempting to authenticate on the end user's behalf, which obviously is going to have a different IP address than the actual user. So something to be aware of there. And then we have passive federation. Passive federation applies to web browsers, documents open via SharePoint Online, additionally Office 2016, as well as Office 2013 with a new public preview patch that's available, brings them into a passive federation consideration. This is the very similar scenario to active federation, where the user will go directly to the ADFS servers to log in. What's important here is that passive federation is supported for multi-factor authentication. And so when we look at applying Windows Azure Active Directory MFA, if we're going strictly through active federation, it won't work. If we're going through basic authentication, it doesn't work. And so we need to look at client endpoints that support the passive federation if we have multi-factor authentication requirements. Pictures help me all the time. So here's a better understanding of what we're looking at based upon all of that information that was just laid out there. Looking at the ADFS server, we've got internal client endpoints. We've got external client endpoints. Typically, but not always, a web application proxy is stood up or some replacement for that There are many load balancers that can take the role of a web application proxy, for example. And what they do is prevent external clients from having direct access to an internal domain join machine, very similar to any other reverse proxy solution if you're familiar with those. Not a requirement, but a very common piece of an ADFS deployment. In here you can see the different ways that connectivity happens. So our Office subscription, OWA internally, Office 2016 would be included in here. They would go directly to the ADFS server internally. This is going to help with that single sign-on experience. If you have a domain join machine, it's going to be able to pass credentials through to the ADFS server and get that single sign-on. If you're looking at legacy versions of Outlook and your active federation, if you're looking at active sync and your basic authentication, they're actually going to pass through a cached username and password to Office 365, which is then going to try and authenticate on the end user's behalf. Above and beyond that, any external connections that would be otherwise passive authentication will go through the web application proxy as well, if there's one in place. So ADFS seems complicated. Why would we do it? What does it add that's so great besides that single sign-on experience, which could be fine, but typically when people move to the cloud, they're not looking to add servers to their local infrastructure. So why do we do it? Client access control is the biggest one that I've seen. We have many organizations that say, I want to move my infrastructure to Office 365. I want to move out to Windows Azure. I want to publish applications. I want to do all of these great things. But today, we control access to our environment either via VPN or a Citrix or remote app connection, or they have to sit in the office. And so we don't want people going home after hours and having access to this data, or worse yet, pulling this data from the cloud and saving it on their home devices. How can I stop that from happening? Well, we can block all external access to Office 365 based upon the IP address of the external client, because the user has to authenticate against the ADFS server. So we can create rules that say, if it's not one of the IP ranges supported, then don't let them in. We can customize this further to pick out which clients we do want to support, because each rich client has a different footprint. It has or thumbprint, depending on how you want to look at its identity. We can distinguish between them. So I can block access to Office 365 except for ActiveSync, but everything else would be blocked. This would be a very common scenario where we want people to get email on their phone, for example, but we don't want them connecting an Outlook client, say from the local library, and caching all of their data down to a public machine. Well, we can restrict that from happening. We could also block, for example, all external access except for passive browser-based. So we could say you can go to OWA and SharePoint, but again, you can't connect with your Outlook client or say your OneDrive sync client and pull all of our corporate data down onto a personal device or a non-sanctioned device. So if you're looking for same sign-on, if you're looking for simplicity, Azure AD Sync is going to allow you to keep your investment in your local Active Directory, synchronize the accounts out there, synchronize the passwords out there, give the users an experience where they don't have to remember multiple accounts. If you're looking for a true single sign-on experience and or client access control, smart card authentication, conditional access based upon client endpoints or IP ranges, then Active Directory Federation Services is the way that those organizations go. And that ends my presentation on the differences between the two. And I am open for questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. I do have a few questions for you, so we'll go through them. And if for those attendees who didn't ask a question yet, feel free to kind of formulate your question while we're talking. Enter it in the question box, and we'll get to it, time permitting. So first question, so we had one of our attendees asked for a medium-sized organization, they're currently happy with DirSync plus password sync. And they ask, are there any significant advantages, especially around security, to replace that with ADFS?
So the IP address ranges, smart card authentication or restricting client endpoints would be the big pieces that we see from a security standpoint. If you're looking for device security, there are alternatives. Intune provides some conditional access. Office 365 has some conditional access capabilities on its own right now, where you can ensure that only managed devices have access, for example. But in the event that you wanted to truly say you have to be at work to connect to work applications, then ADFS would provide that. If you don't need that today and you're happy with what you've got, you should probably stick with what you've got. And let me elaborate on that. Active Directory Federation Services will take over as your authentication mechanism, which means if ADFS goes down for any reason, you can't log in to Office 365 or Windows Azure Active Directory with that account. And so that becomes a very critical issue. You can have the world at your fingertips from an enterprise, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Skype for Business Online infrastructure, but if you only have a single ADFS server and you reboot it because an update was applied, nobody can log in. Everybody will be disconnected. And so you have to go down the road of high availability. You have to go down the road of site resiliency. You have to go down the road of load balancing. And you have to go down the road of additional security, such as the web application proxies and the high availability and site resiliency that go along with them. So most organizations look at a single server for directory synchronization. And if you go to Active Directory Federation Services, you typically start at 4 servers, 2 apps, 2 ADFS servers, plus load balancing for each of those roles. And so that becomes a significant investment. And if you don't have a good reason to go down that road from a security perspective, most organizations shy away from it.
Got it. And I also have a question, I believe, that is related to that. And the question was, for things like HIPAA, are both compliant, or I guess all scenarios? And I'm not sure if that is in your area of expertise, Matt, but I thought I'd throw it out.
So I can't speak to HIPAA specifically because I'm not qualified, but I have worked with healthcare industries. So I am familiar a little bit with what they're looking for. If you're keeping the authentication local, then you have more control over it. The biggest consideration I've seen is around multi-factor authentication. Now, if you have multi-factor authentication enabled for your Office 365 or your Azure Active Directory accounts, then you can be covered either way. The question would be, do you want to use the Office 365 MFA, which DirSync would essentially point you towards having to use, or would you be looking at an alternative, again, the RSA token, some alternative form of security? If you want to look at those alternative forms of security, you would have to implement ADFS just because that would be required to pull your authentication back down. Beyond that, it's SSL traffic, so it's secured in transit and it's not cached. So my understanding is, from a HIPAA standpoint, if you have the MFA in place, you're typically covered.
Gotcha. All right, so next question. So this is for somebody who's new to this, so bearing that in mind, how would a customer use MFA in an ADFS scenario if they decide to use Enterprise Mobility Suite? Would they even still need ADFS if they're using EMS?
So again, there's always that local IP range consideration, right?
Yeah.
But if you're looking for multi-factor authentication and conditional access and you have Enterprise Mobility Suite, ADFS is not a requirement by any means. We've seen many organizations use directory sync plus password sync, apply the conditional access, and then again, from a managed device standpoint, Intune is continually getting better at putting you in a position to say, not only do you have to have MFA enabled, for example, but you have to be a managed device to be able to get in. Windows 10 supports that now, as well as iOS, Android, Windows Phone. And so I would say, if you're going down the road of MFA plus Intune from an EMS standpoint and you don't have ADFS today, there's not a compelling reason to add that in unless that local IP range is something that you'd be looking to implement.
Gotcha, cool. All right, so let's move on to the next one. This might be a basic answer. I'm not totally sure, but does AD Connect allow for the password reset function in writing back the new password to the on-premises Active Directory?
So it does allow it, but you have to have Azure AD Premium to support password write back.
Gotcha, okay.
Azure AD Connect actually has, not only do they support password write back, but there's also user, group, those might be the only two. I think I'm missing one. But they also have user and group write back in preview. And what that would imply is that you could actually provision accounts and groups in the cloud and have it populate back to your local Active Directory instead of having to populate everything in your local Active Directory. Again, those are in preview, not supported for production environment, but Microsoft's approach is to put organizations in a true hybrid scenario where you have cloud and on-prem and you mix and match and move things where it's appropriate and both continue to play nice regardless of where you start the provisioning path.
Got it, got it. Okay, we have a few more. So this question is from somebody who says, we manage all Exchange accounts in Office 365, but we create matching local users for security group considerations. If we just want password sync and same sign-on, can we just use AD Sync without changing the status of the cloud users who are managed in Office 365? The question elicits a sigh.
The consultant answer in me is it depends. I don't want to give you a definitive answer because I would hate to break what you have today. You should be able to go down that road. ADFS is an authentication mechanism. It is not a provisioning mechanism. It is not a synchronization mechanism. It doesn't have anything to do with groups or rights or permissions. All it does is give you a token that allows you to log in with your local credentials instead of your Windows Azure Active Directory credentials. And so if the concern is about provisioning or access or permissions, ADFS is not a variable in those considerations. That being said, defederation, which is when you remove ADFS from an environment and go back to a straight directory sync solution, can cause some hiccups in that kind of thing. Not necessarily problems, but communication gaps where the end user experience changes or potentially the way that you had been doing things doesn't work anymore and it needs to be revised. And so I don't want to say, yeah, go ahead, it doesn't matter, everything will be fine. It should be, but you would want to make sure that all your variables are accounted for, that there is a proper change window, and that testing and validation occurred afterwards.
Right, and that actually kind of reminds me of another question, which is about or around how easy is it to switch between identity models if business needs or requirements change in terms of time and meeting those requirements and logistics and things that we should be warned about or against.
Mm-hmm. So moving from non-federated to federated is easy. Non-federated is your directory synchronization plus password sync. Federated would be with ADFS. So moving from non-federated to federated, you essentially build up your ADFS infrastructure. You connect to Office 365 or Windows Azure Active Directory through PowerShell, and you say, convert these domains to federated. And so netrixllc.com, for example, we would go in and say, convert netrixllc.com to federated. And through that command line, it would set up what's called a relying party trust. And without digging too deep into it, it essentially tells Office 365 the next time anybody tries to log in with that domain, you're not allowed to authenticate for them anymore. You send them to me. And that's based upon a single URL. ADFS or STS is very common, .domain.com or org or whatever. And then the users all get redirected to the ADFS infrastructure. So if it's built correctly and set up correctly, then that's it. That's the change. You set it, and then the next time you log in, instead of logging in at the portal, you would get redirected to your Office 365 infrastructure. If your domain joined an internal, it would just log you in automatically. So that's relatively simple. Defederating, not quite as simple. Defederating strips away that federation and puts it back to having the portal authenticate for everybody. So you're removing capabilities in terms of a true single sign-on. Additionally, you may be stripping rights that other elements were using. So last time I defederated an environment, one of the issues they ran into is that their pre-configured Skype for Business meetings that were in their Outlook calendar, the link stopped working correctly. Everything else worked fine. Passwords worked fine. They were able to log in. But anytime they clicked on the join meeting link that was created in that calendar, it didn't work.
Interesting.
And they had to go, the calendars were still there, the recurring meetings were fine, but they had to go in and recreate all of their Skype for Business meeting requests.
You know, I think I've experienced that. I think I've experienced that without knowing that that was what I was experiencing.
Additionally, users may be prompted for a password at that point because it is technically a different account that they're logging in with. So there might be an impact to mobile devices. If you have mobile device management solutions in place, they may need to be reconfigured because you are changing the identity in a way that removes the permissions or the access from your local Active Directory and pushes it out. And so, again, it's not terribly difficult to pull the trigger on, but the impact to the end users is typically noticed as opposed to when you federate an account and it's still noticed, but in a positive way versus a negative way.
Gotcha. I think we have time for a couple more questions, and for the questions that we don't get to during this, I'll certainly follow up and make sure that those people who ask questions get answers. So one question that popped up, and I think we do have at least more than one person from the educational field in attendance here, and Matt, I don't know what experience you have with that, but
I went to school.
this, well, yeah. This person says, any suggestion to authenticate external parents in a school organization to facilitate communication between staff and parents?
Yes, so when we look at Windows Azure Active Directory, the discussion pieces, and I apologize, my dog in the background has gotten loud. In these scenarios, what we've talked about are ways to avoid manually entering accounts into Windows Azure Active Directory, right? So that we can leverage existing investment in local Active Directory. If you don't want your users in your local Active Directory, they don't have to be there. You always have the ability to manually populate Windows Azure Active Directory accounts separate from what's in your local Active Directory. Now, the feature sets that are available to them are separate from that identity management. So if you're looking to provide them with, for example, a mailbox in Exchange Online, you can do that, but that account still has to be licensed, and that license still has to be purchased. In the event of education, however, there are caveats to that where the license either comes at a really large discount or doesn't need to be purchased at all, depending on which license plan you look at. But the mailbox still needs to be assigned. So the foundation of all of this is identity and access. But when we looked at the authentication versus the authorization, that's a key difference in the question here. I can get you logged in, but just because you're logged in doesn't mean you can do anything. What you can do goes to what licenses you've purchased and applied to the user once the user exists in that environment. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question, or is that well, a punt?
Definitely seemed like great information to me. We'll see if we hear from the person who asked that question in our question window. So in the meantime, let's do one more, and I know there's a couple we didn't get to, and I think the school organization questioner just said yes. So last one, or maybe if this is short, we might be able to fit in two more. But and thanks again, Matt, for rolling with these questions.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So this question is, if I want granular session management capabilities, max session, inactive sessions, which solution is better?
So Azure Active Directory has limits to that no matter what. Because either way that you authenticate, you're still logging into an Azure Active Directory account, either directly or indirectly with a token from your ADFS infrastructure. You're still logging in as an Azure Active Directory account in the end, and that has session limits and thresholds that are predefined and can't be changed. For example, you can only be logged in from 5 different things on one machine at one time. For example, if I'm logged into the portal and a PowerShell window and then 2 other portals, and then I try and log in, it's going to actually stop me from logging in anymore. That can't be changed regardless of which solution you use. And so to answer the question, it's irrelevant. Either way, you're still ending up as that Azure AD account. And because you're ending up as that account, you're still constrained to the rules that are set on that account.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so we will close with this. If we want to step up or step down security, e.g. MFA, based on IP address, device, or other factors, can Azure AD handle that kind of use case?
Azure AD, and actually the Azure AD multi-factor authentication has a lot of great characteristics around when it comes into play, and it's ever increasing. Solutions, I'm sure there are alternative solutions that have robust configuration options as well, but Azure Active Directory multi-factor authentication does allow feature sets such as if it comes from a specific IP range, then it has to have MFA. If it comes from a specific IP range, it doesn't have to have MFA. Those capabilities are available for that. There are one-time passcodes that you can apply or one-time exceptions where you can say this person can get through without using MFA within a certain time period, so that in the event that they lose their second factor, they can still get logged in once to handle whatever they need to handle. There are phone numbers available, so not only can you get a phone call for the second factor authentication, but you can also call in to report fraud, for example. If you see that your second factor is being triggered but you're not trying to log in. So great feature sets around that. Certainly encourage you to look into that or follow up. I'd be happy to explain that in further detail. But yeah, the short answer is yes, there are configuration options. We would want to look at exactly what your business criteria, your success criteria were versus chasing down the path of here's all the feature sets.
Cool, that makes sense. And that is the last question we're going to have time to cover. And we covered a lot, so that was great Q&A. Thank you, Matt. And one more note for everybody, just to reiterate, we are recording this, so you probably saw some of those emails that I sent out to remind you to log into the session and things like that. You'll get a similar email probably tomorrow with a link to the recording of this session. So if you missed anything or wanted to watch any piece of it again, it will be sent out. So thank you again to Matt and Netrix, and thanks to all the attendees, and hopefully some of you are able to attend our future sessions, another one today and 3 more tomorrow, and we can close with that.
Thank you everyone for your time. I appreciate it.
All right, I'll end the webinar now. Thanks.